Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about headwear again, but this time in a 16th century context. Tudor headwear is a bit controversial. In recent years there have been some changes in the way we interpret certain garments, especially the French hood. That is a can of worms that I plan to get into, but not in this video. We're going to start with a much simpler project this time around, and that project is a coif and a crosscloth. The problem with Tudor coifs is that we have two real sources of documentation for them. Firstly, we have depictions in drawings, in sketches, in woodcuts, and the like, which are quite useful, but they seem to have given rise to a pretty major reenactorism. The problem with these images is that they suggest a multi-piece construction. It looks like a separate caul and brim. Very commonly in reenactment you will see a multi-piece approach to Tudor coifs, which, like an 18th century cap really, will have a brim piece, which can be shaped, which can sort of puff out over the cheeks, and a caul that is gathered into it. The problem with this approach is that it doesn't match up to the extant coifs we have, because we do have a couple of extant pieces, and we also have embroidered pieces that haven't been made up yet, so we have a flat lay of the pattern that is used for a Tudor coif. So on one hand we have this visual depiction of a multi-piece coif, or a coif with a defined back section and front section, and on the other hand we have simpler one-piece coifs in museums. The problem with the multiple pattern piece approach is that, as far as we can make out, it is a Victorian solution to a 16th century garment. Like a lot of historical costuming done by Victorians, it goes for a 16th century flavor and it approximates what we see in those drawings. However, it is done using a more Victorian approach to patterning and construction. It also doesn't really line up with the extant pieces we have at all. So in recent years, a lot of costumers seem to be switching to a simpler pattern like the one I'm wearing now. The Tudor coif is a very simple, basic, and useful garment, although we see fancier versions. It evolves from the sort of swooped or tailed coif that we see in the late 15th century, which is also contentious. However, that is not the focus of this video, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole now. I do have strong thoughts, but I'm not going to talk about that now. Instead, the 16th century coif seems to be cut from a single pattern piece with a drawstring in the back. These can be even simpler than the one I'm wearing now, without lace, but they can also be wired. They can have black work and metalwork embroidery, quite intricately as well. Or they can be used as a basis for a more expensive headpiece. For example, you can wear a coif underneath a French hood to protect the less washable and more expensive silk layer from the oils in your hair. I'm also going to be making a crosscloth in this video, which is a small accessory that can be worn across the forehead and tied at the back of the neck. Sometimes we see this worn on top of the coif, but I prefer it underneath. I especially find that it gives my coif a bit of extra grip, which is very important for me as someone with short hair. The tricky thing about Tudor coifs is that they seem to need a certain amount of hair at the back of the head. Mine has been sliding terribly this video, and I'm struggling with it a bit because I just don't have the taped up braids at the back, which the string can properly sit on and grip to. So if I were to wear this look for a show again, I probably would want to at least pin a hairpiece to the back of my head if I can't manage full braids. But if you have long hair, the coif is going to stay in place so much better than it is for me right now. There is a little bit of variation to even the most basic style of coif throughout the 16th century. However, the basic pattern is the same. I think I'm using a pattern from the Marquis of Winchester's regiment or something like that, and I will link that below. That's just where I got my dimensions, and they've worked well for me, so it's worth at least using as a starting point, although you may have to tweak it based off the size of your head and the amount of hair that you have. So I will put my pattern on screen right now, and again, you can find it in the description below as well. To begin with, I cut one pattern piece out of a sort of an off-white cream linen that I got from Burnley and Trowbridge. It's the same linen that I used for the shift or smock that I'm wearing right now, and I like it a lot. It washes very nicely as well. As you can see, the pattern piece is cut in one. There is a fold at the back of the head, and it'll need to be sewn up at the top of the head in order to close it up. I started off by folding my cap in half and pinning along the top to make the seam. I sewed that up with a back stitch, which really didn't take too long. Next, I ironed that seam open, pressing the seam allowance to both sides, and I felled it down on both sides with a whip stitch to enclose the raw edges and neaten it up. Next up, I hemmed everything except the very bottom edge, which we're going to use later to make a drawstring casing. In order to do my hemming, I folded over the raw edge twice, trying to keep the hem very narrow, and I hemmed it down with a fine whip stitch. I decided to apply my lace before I bothered with the drawstring casing. Obviously, you can skip this step if you want your cap to be plain. However, I found some really cute lace from the Tudor tailor, and I decided to sew that on. I wasn't really sure what the most period accurate technique for this was, but I used a whip stitch and applied the lace to the inside of my hem, which allows it to peek out quite nicely from the finished coif. Next up, I made the drawstring casing. In order to do that, I folded under the raw edge and then folded up about a centimeter and a half in order to make a wider sort of casing. I finished that off by felling it down with a whip stitch again, and I left the ends open so that I could insert a piece of tape later. The next big construction thing to worry about is finishing the very crown of the cap. There are a couple different period accurate approaches to this. We see some very strangely pointed caps where the seam goes along the entire top. However, I've left mine open. You can just gather this in a sort of circle, a bit similar to the back of an 18th century women's cloak as well, but I decided to gather mine up with 2 rows of running stitch to make a stroked gather, and then pin it to the flat part on the top. I'll show you this, it makes more sense visually than verbally. After that, I used a back stitch to secure down my little gathers. And this is how that looks when it's finished. I really hate leaving anything unfinished. I hate any kind of raw edges on the inside of a project, but no source that I've looked at so far has offered any solution to finishing off this little gathered edge, and so against every instinct in my body and my soul, I have left it as is. But the good news is that this means our coif is almost done. The last real step is to run a piece of linen tape through the drawstring casing, which can be very fiddly. I normally accomplish this by wrapping the very end of the tape in cello tape. I got corrected earlier by my filmmaker Omri for calling it Scotch Tape, which apparently is not a thing in this country.
We're in Scotland.
If you're in Scotland and you call it Scotch Tape, comment below to prove Omri wrong. Anyway, after a lot of finagling, I managed to get the tape into the coif, and that is the coif finished. Now we can move on to the crosscloth, which is, again, optional, but really useful. I really wish I was wearing one now. The Tudor tailor books give a pattern for basic crosscloth, and theirs is a bit smaller, and they also recommend that you cut it as a square and just sew tapes to 2 corners. I personally prefer the pattern that the Marquis of Winchester's regiment gives, if I've got their name right, which can be up to 28 centimeters along the sides, and although they suggest you cut it out as a square, they then advise you to fold it in half diagonally and cut along the diagonal, which gives you 2 triangular crosscloths and uses fabric very efficiently. in order to finish off my crosscloth, all I did was hem all 3 sides. I left the 2 corners that I would sew tapes to relatively unfinished because the tapes would deal with that anyway, so I just focused on making a neat, narrow, double-folded hem. I think the worst part of this was hemming on the bias for the long side, but I got through it in the end, and it only came out a little wobbly. I don't know if anything hemmed on the bias will ever come out perfectly anyway though, so I did my best. Before I attached the tapes, I decided to apply a bit of lace to the crosscloth as well. In order to do so, I used the same method that I used for the coif, namely pinning it along the edge of the crosscloth, just the front edge, which is the edge that will be visible when I wear it, and securing it down with a whip stitch. Finally, I sewed on 2, I think they were 30cm tapes to both corners, and finished off the last little unhemmed bit of the corners at the same time. I also hemmed the ends of my tapes so that they wouldn't fray. Should have mentioned, but I did that for the coif as well. And that is my coif and my crosscloth finished. In order to wear them, all I do is wrap the crosscloth around my head and tie the strings at the nape of my neck. The coif goes on top of that, although you can wear it under the crosscloth, like I said earlier. And the strings wrap around my head and also tie at the base of my neck. As you can see, this coif is a bit more shaped than my first attempt at a Tudor coif. It's got more of a curved tulip pattern when it's drafted flat, and that translates into a 3-dimensional coif by giving you a sort of a curved cheek section that is missing from the one I'm wearing right now. And that is my coif and my crosscloth finished and ready for my next 16th century event. If you've watched this far, thank you very much for sticking around, and I hope this video has been helpful. If you enjoyed this video, please do like, comment, and subscribe. I've also linked my Instagram in the description, as well as my Ko-Fi account, in case you'd like to contribute to this channel and help us make more videos in the future. Again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.